For 2 decades, runaway debt and crushing taxes have plagued taxpayers and threatened to bankrupt several states. Is it government of the people, for the people, and by the people, or is it simply a shakedown of the American taxpayer? I'm Allen Barton. You're watching a special edition of The Front Page. Joining me in the PJTV Los Angeles studios is Stephen Malanga, City Journal senior editor, a RealClearMarkets.com columnist, and a Manhattan Institute senior fellow. He is a well-credentialed man. He is also the author of the new book, Shakedown: The Continuing Conspiracy Against the American Taxpayer. It's a great read, somewhat depressing, but a great read. Steve, thanks for joining us today. Why don't we get down to it? Why this book now? You're talking about trends that have been going on for decades. Sure. What are you doing in terms of addressing it today?
Well, you know, I've been writing about this phenomenon for quite a long time, and in 2005 I published a book called The New Left, which I defined as the self-interested left, the coalition, the big government coalition of public sector unions and social advocacy groups who essentially exist off of government money and who therefore are always in favor of bigger government and more programs, regardless of whether they work or whether we need it or not. At the time that I wrote that book, even I could not have predicted that within 3 years we would have a former tax-funded community activist in the White House. We would have the whole agenda of the New Left that we had seen in Sacramento and in Albany and in Trenton, now in Washington. And we would have such a great recession and fiscal crisis that we would have states and cities on the verge of bankruptcy. And so I thought it was time to bring this to the American people again, sort of update it. I feel a little bit like Michael Corleone in Godfather Part 3. I keep trying to get away from this. They keep pulling me back in.
Now, the word conspiracy is a strong word because it's not as though you're talking simply about inertia or the kind of what in military they'd call it mission creep or this idea. Sure. The word conspiracy is a very specific word. Why don't you talk about that in relation to what you're dealing with here in terms of these?
One way of thinking about that is if you look at, for instance, some of the reforms that people who seem to be on top of this are advocating, like Chris Christie in New Jersey, they're just not saying, let's cut taxes again, or let's stop the growth of government and get back the free market spirit. They're also saying, by the way, all these things have been done over the years, a lot of them in backroom deals, a lot of them in legislation attached to big bills that people weren't looking and didn't understand the significance of them. And so that suddenly we wake up and we find out, for instance, that a lot of states have been gerrymandered so that basically the incumbents never lose. I mean, New York State, only 20% of the people in New York State approve of the state legislature, but 98% of legislators get reelected. Those numbers don't fit together. How is that happening? Arbitration rules that automatically favor public sector unions and keep giving them money even when we can't afford it. There's a whole structure that has happened. Organizing drives in California where public sector workers were organized in ways that had nothing to do with being on the picket line. It's not like picketing General Motors, and it's really about backroom
stuff. Well, you covered a very sort of interesting moment in history that I'd like you to talk about, the public sector unions having collective bargaining power, which they used to not have. It used to be kept, even in New York City, they were like, no. Tell us about how that changed.
Well, really, it changed. It was about political power, because what happened is you had politicians who wanted their support of the support of public sector unions, and many of them, they did not have collective bargaining because it was argued, well, number one, government's a monopoly. You can't really give collective bargaining to a monopoly. Number two, they're protected by civil service already. And number three, if you give them this power, then what's going to happen is they will have the power to elect their own bosses, and that's just not going to work. But there were politicians like Robert Wagner, the mayor of New York City, who was in a battle with Tammany Hall, the political machine there, and he thought, I need allies. Public sector workers are among the allies. He gave them the right to collectively bargain there in the late 1950s. Once he did that, other politicians around the country saw this, saw that they could be allies, these public sector workers, and did the same thing. And then it just, you know, it came late in California, not till the late 60s and then the 70s, but it came everywhere eventually.
And let's talk about California. I want to cover a couple of states here. You addressed it. I mean, California obviously is a symbol right now of a huge, catastrophic mess. And not that long ago, 20, 25 years ago, California was seen as this bastion of economic opportunity and freedom. What happened in these 25 years?
Well, you know, one of the things, if you look, it's not only California. New Jersey was also a very prosperous state, richest state on a per capita basis in the country. New York before that. Illinois, once a very prosperous state. One of the things I've noticed in writing about this, and one of the things I argue, that it's actually, this big government coalition is very good at upending prosperity. And the reason they are is this. As states grow more prosperous, they attract more people. That means government has to grow bigger. In addition to this, prosperity brings higher standards of living. When standards of living go up, people say, well, maybe we need more government. Maybe we can afford to spend more on our schools, more. eventually what happens is government reaches a tipping point where it becomes so big that it becomes the most dominant force in Sacramento, in Albany, in Trenton. And that's what happened in California. It reached that tipping point, and before you know it, things were kind of gradually, you know, one piece of legislation after another, piled on top of another. You get to the point where government is in control, and you wake up and you say, how did this happen?
And talk to us a little bit also about the war on poverty, which obviously started with Johnson in the 60s, and what effect that has had in terms of fueling the increasing power.
In particular, that has helped to fuel the other side of this coalition, the other element of this coalition, which is the social service advocacy part of it. And what happened essentially is that during the war on poverty, we had this worthwhile but naive idea that if we just spent billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, we could cure poverty. They didn't quite know how to do it, the framers of the war on poverty. So what they did is, look, we're going to send this money to states and cities, and they're going to give it to local community groups. They'll know how to make their communities better. Well, what they didn't understand is they were essentially creating a whole universe of thousands and tens of thousands of tax-funded community activists who, after a while, figured out, in order to keep the money going, we've got to become politically active. And so the tail began wagging the dog.
And God forbid they actually solve poverty. Well, because, I mean, if they actually were able to solve poverty, their own existence would be...
Exactly. You have hit it right. But here's the thing. Exactly because of that, something happened in government where government became no longer, a lot of programs, no longer about results. So they would begin arguing, you know, these are supposed to be originally anti-poverty programs. Well, we're not actually solving poverty this way, so why are we continuing to fund these groups? Well, you don't understand. You can't judge us on those grounds.
You can't judge us on results.
Exactly.
Come on.
You know what? That's what
old thinking.
That is what a lot of our social service programs are about. When we have job training programs in America that don't actually give people jobs, we continue funding them. Why? Well, they say, well, you can't really judge us on that grounds. You know, if you do, we'll only take in the people who are likely to get jobs. So it's a kind of dysfunctional metric where they don't want government to actually be judged by its results anymore. And that is pervasive, actually, in government these days.
Talk to us a little, you talk in the book about the worst urban program in existence. Can you talk a little bit about this? Because this is a real mess.
That is a perfect example of that. Community Development Block Grants, which grew out of the anti-poverty efforts. They spent about $130 billion in American cities over the years, and it's difficult to find what they've actually succeeded. There have been a lot of investigations. They just basically give up money. I'll give you an example. In Los Angeles, in 1992, after the riots, the Watts riots in Los Angeles, the South Central riots in Los Angeles, essentially what the government said is, here's millions of dollars of community development block grant money. Take this money and use it to try to cure the roots of the riot. Well, nobody knew what the roots of the riot actually were. So what did they do in Los Angeles? They just gave the money to groups they were already giving it to. And a report by the Government Accountability Office said basically nobody knew where the money went. Nobody knew how to give this money out. They just gave it out to people who are already giving money. That's the kind of thinking that you have in government, where it's not like people say, well, you know, do we know what the problem is? Do we know how to attack it? Okay, then here's the money. Let's go. And by the way, did we get results? That doesn't happen too often.
So, and here we are, you know, 50 years or 40 years or some odd after the war on poverty begins, and we have pretty much the exact same rate of poverty now than we did back then. We've just spent $1 trillion trying to fight it and have created this incredible, sick, siphoning bureaucracy on future tax dollars.
Well, and the irony is that we actually had a greater decline in poverty in this country from 1959 to 1967 than we did from after the war on poverty actually got going. It started getting funded in late 66, 67, but we went, you know, the early 60s when we had prosperity in America, poverty was going down.
Well, one of the results, if you want to call it that, that is scary, and that you get to in the book, is that what this has created is a culture of entitlement. And that culture of entitlement really can be perhaps the most dangerous thing of all, because that as well feeds off of big government, the expectation of big government, the expectation of reallocation of wealth, transfer of wealth to other people, which seems to be the thing that keeps this thing going.
Well, I would say, first of all, that the culture of entitlement really produced perverse consequences among the poor in America. But it did something more than that. The culture of entitlement has gradually sort of spread out into the middle class. This is what happened in Europe, so that now reform is so hard in Europe, because when you talk about the welfare state in Europe, you're really talking about middle class entitlements. Here in the United States, if you look at things like housing policy, for instance, more and more it's about Everybody deserves something. Everybody deserves something. And that, I argue in the book, led, at least in part, to the housing meltdown. So one of the dangers we have is that this notion of a culture of entitlement, that government can give us things, when it becomes so pervasive, it is going to spread to the middle class and then beyond, and then reform becomes virtually impossible.
And when we talk about reform, what are we talking about? I mean, how do we do it? Obviously, you have something like an event like in California, we had the City of Bell blow up.
Right.
You know, the theft of the taxpayer was so extreme, so flagrant, so awful that the populace kind of got outraged. And now, will that result in change? It's going to result in some people behind bars, and that makes people feel good. What will affect change? Is it a person? Is it someone like Chris Christie in New Jersey, where you see like, okay, here's a guy who seems to get it, voice it clearly, and has the gumption to go after and make change? Right. Combination of both?
One of the things that we see, first of all, I think change is different in different places, because I really think this starts from the cities, and it starts from the states and works its way up, not the other way down. It doesn't come from Washington. At the Manhattan Institute, we like to say that politicians are lagging indicators, not leading indicators, that it really comes from the voters, it really comes from a sense of discussed. I do think that you see that movement right now in America, but you do have to have leaders to step forward, like a Chris Christie, to take advantage of it. You know, you can compare what's happening in New Jersey with Christie to New York State, where I don't really see a reform leader that people feel comfortable voting with, even though it's clear from some of the voting patterns in the primaries in New York State that people are looking for change. So
if there had been a Chris Christie type instead of Palladino,
boy, I think he
could have won.
I think he would, I think he would have had a very, very good chance in this election.
So you do need someone who can channel this disgust and this viewpoint and focus it
because it's not just about anger, as people are saying in New York State. Anger is not itself a platform. The anger of the voters is a great launching point. But if you listen to Christie, he's figured out quite a bit. He's figured out what needs to be done, what the process is. If you listen to him articulate, why this is a problem, where our problems come from, he's very good. He's very good about answering criticisms from the public sector unions, who are fond of saying things like, it's really about the children, it's really about the kids. He has been great at that. And so you need both ends of it. And I think he's becoming a model. You can see politicians around the country emulating his approach.
All right, thanks so much. We could go on for half an hour about this. Thank you, Stephen Malanga. That's Steve Malanga, City Journal Senior Editor, Manhattan Institute Senior Fellow, and author of Shakedown, available now online and at your local bookstore. Now, viewers, what are your thoughts? Can public service union power be rolled back? How far can taxpayers be squeezed before we fight back? We want to know. Click on the comment button below. I'm Allen Barton. You've been watching a special edition of The Front Page.